They called it der amerikanische Traum, the American dream, but not in the way Americans understood it. For the German prisoners of war transported across the Atlantic in 1943, the American dream was a nightmare of industrial might that shattered their belief in victory. The journey from capture to the heartland of their enemy would force 40% of these men to confront a devastating truth. Germany had already lost the war, not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The date was May 12, 1943. The North African campaign was collapsing for the Wehrmacht. As Allied forces closed in on the last German strongholds in Tunisia, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim found himself commanding the remnants of what had once been Rommel's proud Afrika Corps. In his command bunker outside Tunis, von Arnim received reports that American Sherman tanks were breaching their final defensive lines. Not just a few tanks, dozens, then hundreds. The German panzer reserves had been depleted to barely operational levels, while the Americans seemed to produce tanks from thin air. "It's as if they have an endless supply," one of his staff officers remarked. Von Arnim nodded grimly. He had no way of knowing that this observation would become the central psychological shock for thousands of his men in the coming months. When Tunis fell on May 13th, followed by the surrender of all Axis forces in North Africa on May 13th, 1943, over 275,000 German and Italian troops became prisoners of war. Among them was Feldwebel Sergeant Karl Müller, a 26-year-old tank commander from Dresden, who had served with the 15th Panzer Division since 1941. His journey would become emblematic of the psychological transformation that awaited German POWs in America. Müller had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, driven by patriotism and the promise of restoring German pride after the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. Like many of his generation, he believed wholeheartedly in German superiority, technologically, culturally, and militarily. The early Blitzkrieg victories seemed to confirm this worldview. Even as the tide began to turn in North Africa, most German soldiers maintained their faith in ultimate victory. They attributed setbacks to temporary supply problems, not to any fundamental weakness in German war capacity. This faith was about to be severely tested. The processing of prisoners began immediately after capture. American military police separated officers from enlisted men, cataloged personal information, and prepared the prisoners for transport. Müller and thousands of others were first taken to temporary holding camps in North Africa. The conditions were basic but humane, far better than what awaited Allied prisoners in German hands, though the POWs had no way of knowing this. "We expected to be treated harshly," Müller later wrote, in a diary that would be discovered decades later in a Minnesota attic. "The propaganda had told us Americans would be brutal captors. When they gave us cigarettes and adequate food, many of us became suspicious. We thought it was a trick to make us lower our guard." Within weeks, a massive logistical operation began to transport selected POWs to the United States. The decision to move prisoners across the Atlantic was primarily practical. Keeping hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers in the North African theater required resources that could be better used for the war effort. America, with its vast territory and distance from the fighting, was the logical destination. The selection process was not random. American intelligence officers specifically chose prisoners they believed might be valuable sources of information or who might be receptive to re-education. They also selected representatives from different units to gain a broader understanding of German military operations. Müller, with his technical knowledge of German armor, was among those selected for transport. In late June 1943, Müller and approximately 1,500 other German POWs were loaded onto the USS West Point, a converted luxury liner that had been transformed into a troop transport. The ship was part of a convoy crossing the Atlantic, a journey still fraught with danger from German U-boats, though the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was turning in the Allies' favor. The voyage took nearly 2 weeks. Conditions were crowded, but not inhumane. American guards maintained discipline, but were not abusive. For many prisoners, including Miller, the most striking aspect of the journey was the sheer size of the convoy, dozens of ships stretching to the horizon, each laden with war material bound for Europe. It was their first glimpse of American logistical capacity. "I counted 27 ships in our immediate vicinity," Miller wrote. "Our convoy officer, a lieutenant from Nebraska, told me there were dozens of such convoys crossing at any given time. I didn't believe him then. I thought it was propaganda. I would learn he was telling the truth." The USS West Point docked in New York Harbor in early July 1943. For security reasons, prisoners were kept below decks as the ship navigated past the Statue of Liberty and the Manhattan skyline. But even from their restricted vantage point, the prisoners could sense the scale of the city through the small portholes. The processing at Camp Shanks, New York, was efficient and thorough. Prisoners were documented, deloused, given American POW uniforms, and assigned to camps across the country. The Geneva Convention specified that prisoners should be held in a climate similar to that where they were captured. So many POWs from the Africa Corps were sent to camps in the American South and Southwest. Mueller and 400 others were assigned to Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Before departing New York, however, they experienced their first profound shock, the New York Central Railroad Station. As they were marched under guard through a section of the station, the scale of the infrastructure was unlike anything most had ever seen. The station alone was bigger than many German town centers, one prisoner, Friedrich Weber, later recalled. The number of tracks, the size of the locomotives, it made our Deutsche Reichsbahn look like toys. Some men began whispering among themselves, if this was just their railroad station, what must their factories be like? The journey to Mississippi became a rolling revelation. The train traveled through cities and towns untouched by war, no bomb damage, no blackouts, no visible rationing. Factory complexes sprawled across the landscape, smokestacks belching at full production. At night, cities glowed with lights that had long been extinguished in Germany under Allied bombing. For men who had been told that America was suffering, that U-boats were strangling its supply lines, that its production was crippled, the evidence before their eyes was jarring. Their first crisis of faith began on that train journey. "We passed a factory outside Pittsburgh," Miller wrote. "It stretched for what seemed like kilometers. American tanks were lined up outside, hundreds of them, fresh from the assembly line. Hans Schmidt, who had been a factory worker in civilian life, looked at me with hollow eyes and said, 'Carl, how can we possibly win against this?'" Camp Shelby, Mississippi was one of nearly 500 POW camps established across the United States during World War II. By the end of the war, these camps would hold approximately 425,000 enemy prisoners, with Germans making up the vast majority. The camps were built according to the same specifications as American military training camps: wooden barracks, central mess halls, recreation facilities, and medical clinics. Miller's first impressions of Camp Shelby were recorded in his diary. "The Americans have built a small German village in the middle of Mississippi. The barracks are clean and solid. The food is better than what we had in Africa for months. Most surprising is the quantity. They feed us until we are full. In Germany, I know civilians are on strict rations, yet here, in the heart of enemy territory, we eat better than German civilians." This abundance extended beyond food. The camp had a library, sports fields, and eventually craft shops where prisoners could pursue hobbies. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted POWs could be required to work, but they had to be paid and could not be forced to work directly for the war effort. It was this work program that delivered the next psychological blow to the German prisoners' morale. Beginning in late 1943, POWs were assigned to labor details outside the camps, primarily in agriculture, but also in logging, food processing, and light manufacturing. They were transported through American towns, past American factories, and into the American heartland. For Miller and many others, these work details provided direct exposure to America's industrial might. In September 1943, his group was assigned to help harvest cotton on plantations near Camp Shelby. The mechanization of American agriculture was their first shock. The harvesters they use here do the work of 50 men, Miller noted. The farmer told us he had 3 sons in the Pacific fighting the Japanese, yet his crop would still be harvested on time because of these machines. In Germany, with so many men at the front, the harvest depends on women, children, and old men working by hand. Other POW work details reported similar experiences. A group assigned to a canning factory in Illinois watched as thousands of food tins were produced hourly, each filled with more meat than German civilians saw in a week. Prisoners working near shipyards in Alabama and Mississippi witnessed the launching of Liberty ships, massive cargo vessels that American shipyards were producing at the rate of 1 every 24 hours by 1943. Johann Becker, a former U-boat crewman captured after his submarine was sunk, wrote home, "Remember how Admiral Dönitz told us each U-boat was sinking 3 ships for every one the Americans could build? It's not true. I've seen their shipyards. They launch more ships in a week than we could sink in a month." The censors allowed this letter to go through, part of a deliberate policy. American authorities recognized the value of having German prisoners witness American productivity firsthand and then communicate their observations back to Germany. By late 1943, a significant psychological shift was occurring among the German POW population. Military intelligence officers conducting interviews with prisoners noted increasing pessimism about Germany's chances for victory. One report from December 1943 stated, "Approximately 40% of prisoners now express the belief that Germany cannot win the war." This represents a dramatic increase from June 1943, when less than 10% expressed such views. This transformation was not universal. Many prisoners, particularly those with strong Nazi convictions, remained committed to the belief in ultimate victory. They developed various explanations for what they were witnessing. The American production was impressive, but unsustainable. The quality of American equipment was inferior despite the quantity, or that secret German wonder weapons would soon turn the tide. The camps themselves became ideological battlegrounds. Nazi loyalists attempted to maintain discipline and orthodoxy, sometimes threatening or assaulting prisoners who expressed doubts about the war. Camp authorities responded by segregating confirmed Nazis from other prisoners, establishing separate compounds for those deemed anti-Nazi, or at least non-political. Miller found himself in an uncertain middle ground. His diary reveals a man struggling with the evidence before his eyes while trying to maintain loyalty to his country. "What I see here contradicts everything we were told about America. Their production is not crippled. Their people are not starving. Their army is not weak. Yet how can I accept that our leaders lied to us? What does that mean for our cause, for my comrades still fighting?" By early 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, the American authorities implemented a more formal re-education program for German POWs. This program, which would eventually be known as the Intellectual Diversion Program, aimed to expose prisoners to democratic values and accurate information about the progress of the war. Special camps were established, including Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, where selected prisoners who showed intellectual curiosity and openness to new ideas were transferred. The program included lectures, films, and discussion groups covering American history, democratic institutions, and German cultural contributions separate from Nazism. Muller was selected for transfer to Fort Kearny in March 1944. His technical knowledge and his increasingly questioning attitude made him a prime candidate for the program. At Fort Kearny, he encountered something that delivered perhaps the most significant psychological impact of his captivity: detailed knowledge of the Allied bombing campaign against German cities. Today they showed us photographs of Hamburg after the firestorm raid, he wrote in April 1944. Dresden, my home, is still largely untouched. But for how long? The American officer who led the discussion was not boastful. He seemed genuinely sad about the destruction. He said it was necessary to end the war quickly. Looking at the scale of bombing they can deliver, I am starting to think he might be right. The spring of 1944 brought more evidence of American industrial dominance. As preparations for D-Day accelerated, the prisoners witnessed an increasing tempo of military shipments heading to ports. Even in POW camps far from the coasts, the evidence was visible in increased rail traffic, new military vehicles on the highways, and the constant stream of aircraft overhead. A POW camp newspaper at Fort McClellan, Alabama, produced by prisoners themselves under light censorship, published an article in May 1944 titled Die amerikanische Produktionsschlacht, the American Production Battle. The anonymous prisoner author wrote, Germany entered this war believing in the superiority of its will, its organization, and its weapons. America entered believing in the superiority of its productive capacity. We are now witnessing which belief was correct. The D-Day invasion in June 1944 marked another turning point in prisoner morale. News of the successful Allied landing in Normandy spread quickly through the camps. Nazi loyalists insisted it was a temporary success that would soon be reversed by German counterattacks. But as weeks passed and the Allied forces pushed inland, this position became increasingly difficult to maintain. By August 1944, as Paris was liberated and Allied forces approached the German border, military intelligence reported that the percentage of German POWs who believed Germany would lose the war had risen to over 60%. Among those captured in North Africa, who had been in America longest and had the most exposure to American industrial might, the figure approached 75%. For Mueller, the psychological journey reached its conclusion in September 1944. At Fort Kearny, prisoners were given controlled access to news publications and radio broadcasts. The evidence of Germany's deteriorating position became impossible to ignore. Allied armies were crossing into Germany itself. German cities were under round-the-clock bombing, and fuel and material shortages were crippling the Wehrmacht's ability to respond. I finally admitted to myself today what I have known in my heart for months, Mueller wrote on September 20, 1944. Germany has lost this war. It was lost before I was captured, perhaps even before it began. No nation, no matter how brave its soldiers, could overcome the productive power I have witnessed here. For every tank we destroy, they build 10 more. For every plane we shoot down, another takes its place the next day. This realization was not a rejection of Germany, but rather of the Nazi regime that had led it to destruction. Like many German POWs who came to similar conclusions, Mueller began to distinguish between loyalty to country and loyalty to the Nazi government. This distinction would become crucial in the post-war period. As 1944 drew to a close, American authorities noted a significant change in the atmosphere of many POW camps. The rigid hierarchies imposed by Nazi loyalists were breaking down. More prisoners were volunteering for work details, not just for the extra privileges and pay, but for the opportunity to escape the ideological tensions in the camps. Work productivity increased dramatically. Camp commanders reported that German POWs were often more efficient and disciplined workers than available civilian labor. At Camp Shelby and other locations, local farmers and businesses began specifically requesting German POW labor for its quality and reliability. This change reflected a profound psychological adjustment. Having accepted that Germany would lose the war, many prisoners began to focus on individual survival and preparation for the post-war world. Learning English, acquiring new skills, and understanding American society became priorities for forward-thinking POWs. The American authorities encouraged this transition. By late 1944, the War Department had expanded educational opportunities in the camps. Prisoners could take correspondence courses through local universities, learn trades, and even earn certificates that might help them find employment after repatriation. At Fort Kearny, Miller enrolled in engineering courses offered through the University of Rhode Island. His diary entries from this period show a man looking toward the future rather than dwelling on the lost cause. I spend my evenings studying American technical manuals. Their approaches to engineering problems are different from ours, more pragmatic, less theoretical. There is much we could learn from each other in peacetime. This transformation was happening against the backdrop of Germany's increasing military collapse. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, briefly rekindled hope among Nazi loyalists in the camps. When it failed, even many hardliners began to accept the inevitable. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the mood in the POW camps shifted again. Concern for families back in Germany took precedence over ideological considerations. Prisoners gathered around maps, tracking the advances of American forces from the West and Soviet forces from the East, hoping their hometowns would fall to the Americans rather than the Russians. The death of President Roosevelt in April 1945 revealed how much had changed. In many POW camps, prisoners requested permission to lower their flags to half-staff as a sign of respect. At Camp Shelby, German POWs sent a delegation to the camp commander asking if they could contribute to a memorial for the deceased president. These gestures reflected not just diplomatic courtesy, but a genuine shift in perspective. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the reaction in POW camps across America was complex. There was grief for the defeat and concern for the fate of Germany under occupation. But for many, including Miller, there was also relief that the destruction had ended and hope for rebuilding. Germany has surrendered, Miller wrote. The war that was to last 1,000 years is over after 6. Now comes the harder task, rebuilding not just our cities, but our national soul. We must remember how we came to this point and ensure it never happens again. In the immediate aftermath of the surrender, American authorities faced a new challenge, preventing despair among the POW population. With their country defeated and occupied, uncertainty about the fate of families, and the emerging news of Nazi atrocities, many prisoners fell into depression. The response was to give POWs a stake in Germany's future. The re-education program was intensified and expanded to all camps. Films documenting Nazi crimes were shown, not to shame ordinary German soldiers, but to help them understand the necessity of building a new, democratic Germany. This approach proved remarkably effective. By summer 1945, military intelligence reported that nearly 74% of German POWs expressed support for democratic reforms in post-war Germany. The percentage was highest among those who had been in America longest and had witnessed its industrial and social systems firsthand. For Karl Müller and thousands like him, the journey from capture to acceptance had fundamentally altered their worldview. The American dream that had once seemed a propaganda nightmare had become something else entirely, a possible model for Germany's own reconstruction. As 1945 progressed into autumn, the repatriation process began. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to be returned to their home countries as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace. With Germany under Allied occupation rather than having a sovereign government to make peace with, the process was complicated. The American authorities implemented a priority system. Those deemed ardent Nazis would be repatriated last, while those who had demonstrated democratic attitudes and worked productively would go home first. This policy served both as an incentive for cooperation and as a strategy to influence Germany's reconstruction by returning reformed POWs early. Müller qualified for early repatriation. In October 1945, he was transferred to Camp Shanks, New York, the same facility where he had first entered America 2 years earlier. The contrast between his arrival as a confident German soldier believing in eventual victory and his departure as a man transformed by witnessing American industrial might, was stark. His final diary entry before boarding the transport ship captured this transformation. "Tomorrow we sail for Europe. I return to a Germany in ruins, yet I go with hope. I have seen what a nation can achieve when it directs its energies toward production rather than conquest. If we Germans can learn this lesson from defeat, perhaps someday our children will live in a Germany as prosperous and free as America." The ship departed New York Harbor on October 28, 1945. As the skyline receded, Miller and the other returning prisoners gathered on deck. Among them were men who had arrived as devoted Nazis and were leaving with their worldview shattered. There were others who had never embraced Nazi ideology and felt vindicated by its defeat. And there were many like Müller, ordinary Germans who had followed their country into war and had experienced a profound education through defeat. What awaited them in Germany was hardship, destroyed cities, food shortages, military occupation, and the collective shame of Nazi crimes revealed at Nuremberg and elsewhere. Yet they returned with something valuable: first-hand knowledge of an alternative system and the industrial power it could generate. The full impact of their experience would only become apparent in the years that followed. As Germany divided into East and West, those repatriated to the Western zones would play a significant role in the reconstruction process that would eventually be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of West Germany. The skills they had learned in American camps, the work ethic they had demonstrated on labor details, and, most importantly, the psychological transformation they had undergone made them valuable contributors to building a new Germany from the ashes of the old. For the 40% who lost hope after seeing America's industrial might, a percentage that would grow to nearly 75% by war's end, the experience proved paradoxically liberating. By accepting Germany's defeat, not as a failure of German courage or capability, but as the inevitable result of industrial disparity, they could envision a future in which Germany redirected its considerable talents toward peaceful production. In the decades that followed, historians would recognize the POW experience in America as one of the most successful rehabilitation programs in military history. Unlike the millions of German POWs who disappeared into Soviet captivity, those who spent the war in American camps returned with more than just their lives. They returned with a blueprint for reconstruction. The story of Karl Müller ends with his return to Dresden in the Soviet occupation zone. Unlike many of his fellow POWs who would contribute to West Germany's reconstruction, Müller's engineering skills would be put to use rebuilding infrastructure under communist direction. His subsequent fate is lost to history. His diary ends with his return voyage, and records from East Germany remain incomplete. But the transformation he and hundreds of thousands of others underwent in American captivity remains one of the war's most consequential untold stories. The psychological journey from belief in German invincibility to recognition of American industrial supremacy fundamentally shaped the post-war world. As the Cold War began and Germany split between East and West, the legacy of this experience would become even more significant. The economic competition between systems would replace military confrontation as the primary battlefield. And on that battlefield, the lessons learned by German POWs about American productive capacity would prove decisive in shaping the Western approach to confronting communism. The ultimate proof of this transformation came decades later. In reunified Germany, historians interviewing elderly veterans who had been POWs in America frequently heard variations of the same sentiment. "I knew Germany would lose the war the day I saw my first American factory." For the 40% who lost hope, and the many more who would follow, this realization was both an end and a beginning. The psychological impact of American industrial might on German POWs extended far beyond the immediate recognition of military defeat. For men raised in the Prussian military tradition, where valor and tactical brilliance were considered the decisive factors in warfare, The revelation that wars could be won on assembly lines rather than battlefields required a complete recalibration of worldview. This recalibration is vividly illustrated in the experience of Oberleutnant Werner Drexler, a former U-boat officer captured in 1944 after his submarine was sunk in the Atlantic. Drexler, unlike Müller, had come from Germany's military aristocracy. His father and grandfather had been officers. He had attended the finest military academies. He had been indoctrinated with the belief that German military excellence could overcome any material disadvantage. Upon arrival at Camp McCain in Mississippi, Drexler was assigned to a work detail at a nearby aluminum plant supporting aircraft production. His first day at the facility became a pivotal moment in his captivity. "The scale defies description," he wrote to a fellow officer. "An aircraft factory in Bavaria might produce 5 fighters in a good week. Here, they roll a bomber off the line every hour. The workers are not driven by fear or patriotic fervor. They work efficiently because the production line is designed for maximum output with minimum effort. It is not just that they build more with less human input." This observation touched on something fundamental: the different philosophies underlying German and American production. German manufacturing emphasized craftsmanship, precision, and technical superiority, producing exceptional weapons, but in limited quantities. American manufacturing embraced standardization, interchangeable parts, and production efficiency, creating weapons that were sometimes technically inferior but overwhelmingly superior in quantity. Wehrmacht officers had been aware of this disparity in theory, but seeing it in practice forced a painful reassessment. Major Heinrich Brüning, captured in Sicily in 1943 and held at Camp Forrest in Tennessee, expressed this realization in a letter that was intercepted by camp censors. "Our Panther tank is a superior fighting machine to the Sherman. Our Me-262 jet fighter outclasses anything in the Allied air forces. But what does technical superiority matter when the enemy can lose 10 tanks for every one of ours and still have more tanks tomorrow? What good is a superior fighter plane when the enemy darkens the sky with bombers?" This war has not been decided by tactics or courage, but by smokestacks and assembly lines. By early 1945, this recognition had penetrated deeply into the POW population. Camp authorities noted a significant change in prisoner discourse. Conversations shifted from military developments to economic questions. How had America achieved such productive capacity? How could Germany reorganize its industry after the war? What lessons could be learned from American methods? This intellectual shift manifested in practical ways. When given the opportunity to access reading materials, prisoners increasingly requested books and magazines about American industry, engineering, and business organization. Popular titles included descriptions of the Ford assembly line, management techniques at General Motors, and agricultural mechanization in the Midwest. At Camp Shelby, where Carl Miller had been initially held, a prisoner-organized lecture series featured talks by POWs who had worked in German industry before the war. They compared German and American manufacturing approaches, often concluding that German emphasis on quality over quantity had been a strategic mistake in a global conflict. "We built handcrafted masterpieces while they built Model Ts," summarized one former Daimler-Benz engineer in a camp lecture. Both approaches have merit, but in war, quantity has a quality all its own. The American authorities recognized the value of this self-directed learning. By 1945, the War Department had expanded educational opportunities in POW camps to include industrial management and engineering courses. These programs served the dual purpose of keeping prisoners productively occupied and preparing them to contribute to Germany's peaceful reconstruction. For many prisoners, this education literally expanded their horizons. Wilhelm Kramer, a former tank commander held at Camp Cook in California, recalled his first visit to an American farm as part of a work detail. "The farmer showed us his new harvester. One machine was doing the work that would require an entire village at home. When I asked how many such machines existed in America, He laughed and said, "There were hundreds of thousands." Then he showed us a catalog where you could order one delivered to your farm. The idea that such technology was not reserved for the state, but available to ordinary citizens, was revolutionary to me. This accessibility of technology and prosperity represented a direct challenge to Nazi ideology, which had emphasized the necessity of territorial conquest to secure resources for the German people. Here was evidence that prosperity could be achieved through production rather than expansion, a concept that directly contradicted the Lebensraum, living space doctrine, that had helped drive Germany to war. By mid-1945, with Germany's defeat official, American authorities implemented a more systematic approach to re-education. The intellectual diversion program was expanded into what would eventually be called the Special Projects Division. Selected POW camps were designated as centers for democratic re-education, where prisoners were systematically exposed to American values, institutions, and history. Fort Eustis, Virginia became one such center. There, prisoners published their own newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, which explicitly advocated for a democratic, peaceful Germany. The paper was written and edited by prisoners themselves with minimal American oversight and distributed to POW camps nationwide. Among the regular contributors to Der Ruf was Alfred Andersch, a former soldier who would later become one of post-war Germany's most important writers. Andersch's articles directly addressed the industrial disparity he had witnessed. We Germans believed ourselves superior because our tanks were better designed, our soldiers better trained, our tactics more brilliant. But this war has taught us that the measure of a society is not the excellence of its weapons, but the productivity of its economy and the freedom of its citizens. America's strength lies not in its arms, but in its smokestacks, not in its generals, but in its engineers and workers. This realization was reinforced by the POW's observations of American society beyond the factories. Work details took them into communities untouched by war, where civilian life continued with a normalcy and prosperity that had disappeared from Germany years earlier. They saw well-stocked stores, children attending school without interruption, and communities engaging in leisure activities despite the war effort. Franz Weber, a Wehrmacht infantry sergeant held at Camp Wheeler in Georgia, wrote about accompanying an American guard into town for supplies. The guard stopped at a store to buy cigarettes. The shelves were full: coffee, sugar, meat, things we haven't seen in Germany since 1941. He noticed my surprise and said, "This is normal here." Then he said something I will never forget. "We're so productive, we can fight the biggest war in history and still have plenty for everyone at home." I realized then that Germany had not just been outproduced, but outsmarted. We chose guns over butter, while America somehow managed to have both. The depth of this revelation varied among prisoners. Those with strong Nazi convictions often retreated into denial, insisting that American prosperity was either an illusion created for their benefit or would collapse once the war ended. Others recognized the reality, but attributed it to America's natural resources and isolation from bombing, rather than to its economic system. But for a significant percentage, the 40% that military intelligence identified in late 1943, growing to nearly 75% by war's end, the conclusion was unavoidable. The American system of free enterprise, mass production, and democratic governance had demonstrated decisive superiority over Nazi Germany's centralized, militarized economy. This conclusion had profound implications. For men who had been told that National Socialism represented the most advanced form of social organization, the evidence of American success required either rejecting what they had seen or rejecting what they had been taught. Increasingly, they chose the latter. Camp authorities noted a marked decrease in Nazi symbolism and ritual among prisoners. The display of swastikas, Hitler salutes, and celebration of Nazi holidays declined precipitously. Conversations monitored by intelligence officers revealed increasing criticism of Hitler and the Nazi leadership, for having led Germany into an unwinnable war against a materially superior opponent. How could they not have known, became a common refrain. How could our leaders have been so blind to America's industrial capacity? Did they truly believe we could win against such overwhelming material advantage? The answers to these questions varied, but the questions themselves represented a fundamental break with the unquestioning obedience that Nazi ideology had demanded. By asking how their leaders could have been so wrong, the prisoners were taking their first steps toward independent critical thinking, a prerequisite for democratic citizenship. This transition was encouraged by the American authorities, who recognized that democratically minded German POWs would be valuable assets in post-war reconstruction. By 1945, the Special Projects Division had developed a comprehensive re-education curriculum, including films, lectures, and discussion groups. One particularly effective program brought German-American citizens to the camps as visitors. These were men and women who had emigrated from Germany before the war, established successful lives in America, and maintained their cultural heritage while embracing democratic values. Their example offered prisoners a vision of what German identity could look like divorced from Nazism. Erich Maschke, a former Wehrmacht communications officer held at Camp Breckinridge in Kentucky, recalled such a visit in his post-war memoir. The visitor was a German-American businessman who had left Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power. He had built a successful manufacturing company in Cincinnati. He spoke to us in our native language about how German virtues, diligence, precision, thoroughness, could thrive in a democratic system. Here was a German who had achieved more success and freedom in America than most could hope for in the 1,000-year Reich. His existence challenged everything we had been told. As 1945 progressed, the conversation among prisoners increasingly turned to Germany's future. With their homeland in ruins and under Allied occupation, what path forward seemed most promising? The answer, for many, lay in what they had witnessed in America. Werner Krause, a former Luftwaffe pilot held at Camp Clinton in Mississippi, expressed this sentiment in a letter approved by censors for delivery to his family in the American occupation zone. When we rebuild Germany, we must learn from what I have seen here. Not to become Americans, we will always be Germans, but to understand that prosperity comes from productivity, not conquest. The Americans build a new automobile in less time than we required to repair one. They harvest more wheat with one man than we could with 20. This is not because they are superior beings, but because they have built a superior system of production. This is the lesson we must apply if Germany is to rise from the ashes. This focus on peaceful reconstruction represented a complete reversal from the expansionist militarism that had dominated German thinking. The idea that Germany could achieve prosperity through production rather than conquest directly contradicted the Nazi worldview that had led to war. By late 1945, as repatriation began, American authorities faced a critical decision: how to leverage the changed perspectives of returning POWs to influence Germany's reconstruction. The solution was a tiered repatriation system that prioritized those deemed most receptive to democratic values. The first to return were those who had demonstrated clear anti-Nazi sentiments and embraced democratic principles. These men would become informal ambassadors for democratic values in occupied Germany, spreading what they had learned about American industrial and social organization. This strategy proved remarkably effective. A 1947 study by the American occupation authorities found that communities with high concentrations of returned POWs showed significantly greater acceptance of democratic reforms and less nostalgia for the Nazi period than comparable communities without returned prisoners. The psychological transformation that began with witnessing American industrial might had ripple effects far beyond individual prisoners. It contributed significantly to what historians would later call Germany's mental demilitarization, the profound shift away from militaristic values that had characterized German society for generations. For Karl Miller, returning to Dresden in the Soviet occupation zone presented different challenges than for those POWs repatriated to Western zones. Soviet authorities viewed returning POWs from American camps with suspicion, fearing they had been indoctrinated with anti-communist values. Many were subjected to additional interrogation and surveillance. Miller's technical skills made him valuable to reconstruction efforts, however. His diary resumes in January 1946, after several months of readjustment to life in devastated Dresden. Today, I was assigned to the Municipal Engineering Office. The Russians are efficient but brutal in their approach to rebuilding. They lack the American understanding of how to organize production for maximum efficiency with minimum human cost. I find myself constantly suggesting improvements based on what I observed in Mississippi, though I must be careful not to mention the source of these ideas too explicitly. This caution was well-founded. As Cold War tensions increased, East German authorities became increasingly hostile to any positive references to American systems. Yet the knowledge that Muller and others brought back could not be entirely suppressed. It influenced reconstruction efforts in subtle but significant ways, even in the Soviet zone. In West Germany, returned POWs played a more visible role in reconstruction. By 1948, former prisoners who had worked in American factories or farms were disproportionately represented in management positions in the emerging industries of the Western occupation zones. Their first-hand experience with American production methods made them valuable assets in rebuilding Germany's industrial capacity. Werner Drexler, the former U-boat officer who had been so struck by American aircraft production, found employment with Lufthansa as it began to rebuild German civil aviation. His understanding of American production efficiency informed the airline's post-war organization, helping it become one of Europe's most successful carriers. Heinrich Brüning, the major who had recognized the futility of technical superiority without production capacity, became an advocate for industrial standardization in West Germany's recovering automotive industry. His influence helped shift German manufacturing away from exclusive focus on craftsmanship toward greater emphasis on production efficiency, without abandoning the quality that had always been a hallmark of German engineering. The synthesis of German precision with American production efficiency would become a defining characteristic of West Germany's economic miracle in the 1950s. Companies like Volkswagen, BMW, and Siemens adopted assembly line techniques and standardization while maintaining rigorous quality standards. The result was a manufacturing powerhouse that combined the best aspects of both systems. This transformation was directly influenced by the POW experience. A 1955 survey of executives in West Germany's largest companies found that over 30% had spent time in American POW camps. When asked about influences on their management philosophy, more than half cited observations made during captivity. The impact extended beyond industrial organization to broader economic philosophy. Ludwig Erhard, the economics minister who implemented the currency reform and market liberalization that sparked West Germany's economic recovery, had not been a POW himself, but his policies were enthusiastically supported by business leaders who had witnessed American economic success firsthand during captivity. Erhard's concept of the social market economy, combining free enterprise with social welfare protections, resonated strongly with former POWs who had observed both the productivity of American capitalism and the New Deal social programs that had moderated its excesses. This middle path between unrestrained capitalism and state socialism became the foundation of West Germany's post-war consensus. The psychological journey from military defeat to economic reconstruction is illustrated in the career of Friedrich Bergmann, a former Wehrmacht logistics officer held at Camp Barkley in Texas. After repatriation in 1946, Bergmann joined the management of a small machine tool manufacturer in Stuttgart. In a 1960 interview with a German business magazine, Bergmann explicitly connected his wartime experiences with his business philosophy. As a prisoner, I worked in a Texas oil refinery. What impressed me most was not the size of the operation, though that was overwhelming, but the attitude of the workers. They took pride in productivity. Breaking production records was celebrated more enthusiastically than military victories. This was a revelation that a society could direct its competitive energies toward creation rather than destruction. Bergman applied this philosophy to his company, instituting production bonuses, worker suggestion programs, and regular celebrations of manufacturing milestones. By 1960, his once small company had become a major supplier to Germany's booming automotive industry. This refocusing of national energies from military to economic achievement became a defining characteristic of post-war West German identity. The economic miracle replaced military prowess as a source of national pride. Former POWs who had experienced the psychological shock of seeing American industrial supremacy were uniquely positioned to lead this transformation. The process was not without complications. Many returning POWs struggled with the disconnect between their evolved perspectives and the attitudes of families and communities that had not shared their experiences. Wives, parents, and friends often clung to beliefs in German military excellence and were reluctant to accept that industrial production had been the decisive factor in the war. Otto Schulz, a former infantry sergeant held at Camp Gordon in Georgia, described this challenge in a 1947 letter to an American friend. "My father refuses to believe what I tell him about American factories. He was a soldier in the First War and believes Germany was never truly defeated on the battlefield but was stabbed in the back by politicians." When I try to explain that no amount of battlefield courage could overcome America's productive advantage, he accuses me of having been brainwashed. It is a difficult conversation to have amid ruins. This generational divide would shape West German politics for decades. Older Germans who had not experienced American capitalism firsthand were often more resistant to economic liberalization and more nostalgic for Germany's military traditions. Younger Germans, and especially returned POWs, more readily embraced the new focus on economic rather than military achievement. By the mid-1950s, as West Germany regained sovereignty and began to rearm within NATO, this divide became explicit in debates about the nature of the new German military. Should it revive Prussian traditions of discipline and offensive capability, or should it be a purely defensive force integrated within the Western Alliance? Former POWs, now in influential positions throughout West German society, predominantly supported the latter vision. Their experience had taught them that even the most excellent military tradition could not overcome industrial inferiority. Better to focus national energies on economic development while relying on the NATO alliance for security. This perspective ultimately prevailed. The Bundeswehr, established in 1955, explicitly rejected many Prussian military traditions and emphasized defensive capabilities and integration with NATO. Its founding documents stressed civilian control and democratic values, a direct repudiation of the militarism that had led to 2 world wars. The transformation of German identity from military to economic achievement is perhaps best symbolized by the changing status of Krupp, the industrial giant that had armed Germany for both world wars. In the Nazi period, Krupp had been celebrated primarily as the arsenal of German military might. By the 1960s, it was recognized internationally as a producer of high-quality civilian goods and infrastructure. This shift from guns to butter was driven by many factors, including Allied occupation policies and the practical necessities of reconstruction. But the changed perspective of millions of Germans who had witnessed American industrial capacity, either as POWs or through post-war Marshall Plan aid, was a crucial psychological component of this transformation. For the 40% of German POWs who lost hope after seeing America's industrial might, a percentage that grew substantially by war's end, the experience proved paradoxically liberating. By accepting that Germany had been defeated not by military inferiority, but by productive inferiority, they could envision a future in which Germany competed economically rather than militarily with other nations. This vision ultimately triumphed in West Germany, producing one of history's most remarkable national transformations, from aggressive militarism to peaceful economic competition in a single generation. East Germany, under Soviet domination, followed a different path, but even there, the knowledge brought back by POWs influenced Reconstruction in subtle ways. The full impact of this transformation became apparent only after German reunification in 1990. With the Cold War over, Germany emerged as Europe's economic powerhouse and a leading advocate for continental integration, a complete reversal of its mid-20th century role as Europe's military aggressor and would-be conqueror. The seeds of this transformation can be traced to those moments of revelation experienced by POWs like Karl Müller, moments when the myth of German military invincibility collapsed in the face of American industrial reality. The psychological journey from battlefield to factory floor, from military to economic competition, reshaped not just individual perspectives, but Germany's national identity. Historians have only recently begun to fully appreciate the significance of the American POW experience in shaping post-war Germany. The traditional focus on high-level occupation policies and political developments has often obscured the grassroots impact of returning prisoners who had witnessed American productivity firsthand. Yet the evidence is compelling. Communities with high concentrations of returned POWs showed faster economic recovery, greater acceptance of democratic reforms, and less susceptibility to revanchist or neo-Nazi ideologies than comparable communities without this influence. The story of America's POW re-education program was largely forgotten during the Cold War, when focus shifted to the confrontation with the Soviet Union. Only in recent decades have historians recognized it as one of the most successful rehabilitation programs in military history, not because it converted Germans to American values through propaganda, but because it allowed them to witness American productivity with their own eyes. This experiential learning proved far more effective than any abstract indoctrination. Men who had been raised to believe in German superiority were confronted with irrefutable evidence of American industrial might. The cognitive dissonance this created forced a fundamental reassessment of their worldview. The lessons for modern conflict resolution are significant. Changing deeply held beliefs is rarely accomplished through direct persuasion or propaganda. It requires creating conditions in which individuals can observe alternatives and draw their own conclusions. Exactly what the American POW program, intentionally or not, achieved. For Karl Müller, whose diary provides our window into this transformation, the journey came full circle in 1989. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Müller, then 72, was finally able to travel to West Germany. In a brief addendum to his diary, discovered alongside the main text in that Minnesota attic, he recorded his impressions. "Today, I visited the Mercedes-Benz factory in Stuttgart. It is everything I imagined German industry could become based on what I saw in America all those years ago. The precision of German engineering combined with production efficiency that rivals anything in the United States. We have learned the lesson well, though at terrible cost." Müller died in 1993, having witnessed both Germany's destruction and its rebirth as an economic powerhouse. His intellectual journey, from belief in military solutions to recognition of industrial reality to embracing peaceful production, mirrored Germany's national transformation. The 40% of German POWs who lost hope after seeing America's industrial might did not, in the end, succumb to despair. Instead, they found a new hope, not in military conquest, but in peaceful competition, not in subjugating other nations, but in rebuilding their own. In doing so, they helped create a new Germany that has achieved through economic success what Hitler's war machine could never accomplish through force of arms, a leading role in Europe and respect throughout the world. Their story reminds us that defeat, properly understood, can be the beginning of renewal. For Germany, the lesson of American industrial might was painful, but ultimately productive. A lesson that war is won not primarily on battlefields, but on factory floors, and that a nation's true strength lies not in its capacity for destruction, but in its capacity for creation.